This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. David Martin, the American author, professor, and researcher. You are the founder and CEO of MCAM, which provides research and advice to over 160 countries regarding finance, patents, and trades. What you said recently in front of the EU, along with the emotional content, for me, it's the most powerful thing I've seen in years. And I was curious, how would you describe, what you said? Because I think the average person watching us right now has no idea of the detail that you can break down as far as the traces of what happened to us the last few years.
Brian, a lot of people have asked how I do research. And in the case of not only the coronavirus situation, but in the case of anthrax and in the case of conotoxin, in the case of an enormous number of other things, including the Ebola campaign during the mid-2010s. The difference between what a lot of people do and what I do is I watch the thing as it unfolds. You made reference in the opening to the fact that we advise 168 countries. What I receive inside of our corporate structure is the innovation disclosures, contracts, records of procurement, all kinds of things. And that goes into the Cuisinart of our data. It's how we make our global equity indexes that are traded. It's how we do our business. And so we don't look for things. We actually have a system that flags things. I can set flags for all sorts of things. I can set flags for violations of laws. I can set flags for all sorts of either themes or content or actors or whatever. And in the early 2000s, and a lot of people don't know this, but in the early 2000s, when we were asked to look into the anthrax outbreak, which most people don't even remember. I mean, when we talk about September 2001, everybody thinks about planes and towers. But the global fear in September of 2001, and the thing that was exploited to pass what ultimately became the PrEP Act in 2005, was the anthrax outbreak that allegedly happened at the end of the month. And because of the cognitive dissonance of did planes really fly into towers, people forget that the real terrorist attack was actually anthrax. And the problem about forgetting that is people also forget that several years after the alleged investigation, we were able to definitively and unequivocally and without censorship say the United States Department of Defense attacked America.
And here we are. Dr. David Martin joins us. Dr. Martin, welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Dr. Drew, it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
One quick question, which has got three parts to it. One is you keep referencing we and us were going after these things. Who exactly was us in 2002 for you? Number one. Number two, one of the things that got my attention when you were speaking to the EU Parliament was you said, I've been going after this, or I've been fighting this for over 20 years. So A, who is us? What have you been doing to fight? And then how have people been responding since that video went out? What kind of reception or attacks have you been receiving? So three questions, and then we'll bring Kelly in here. So sorry, it's all lumped into one.
No, it's okay. That's fine. We and Us is my company, MCAM, which is a subsidiary of Mosaic Technologies. We're the ones that do the international review of intellectual property, and we're the ones that have underwritten intellectual property for the world's financial institutions for the last now 25 years. So that is the we. MCAM had a specific mission that included a program called Innovation Literacy, and that innovation program specifically had an allocation of resources that we applied to recording, archiving, and publishing every vital and chemical weapons treaties worldwide. And so the we has been doing this since our first official publication that was submitted to the United States Congress, to the European Union, and to law enforcement and intelligence agencies in 2002. And every year since, we have maintained the only active archive worldwide of every nation state actor and every commercial or corporate or private actor who has violated the Geneva and subsequent conventions on biological and chemical weapons. So what we have done, and your point about 2012, is beginning in October of 2002 at the presidency of the European Union that was held by Denmark during that period of time. I was asked to go to Aalborg, Denmark, and make a presentation on the status of the European Union's, what was called the European Commission's patent initiative. And in that program, I discussed the fact that there was a huge amount of patent activity in Europe, including the amendment of the European patent laws, which were allowing for patents on living systems or living derived systems. And we were suggesting then in 2002 that it was a bad idea. And then in 2012, in response to the breast cancer gene patent lawsuits here in the United States, which we helped take all the way to the Supreme Court, ultimately overturning the Myriad Genetics patents on breast cancer gene diagnostics, what we were doing in 2012 was actually stating to the European Union that there had been a number of violations of biological and chemical weapons laws and of the patent statutes affecting innovations around those particular technologies. And that was the reference I made in my presentation to the European Union Parliament. Now, I have been very frequently, and I'll address this head on. I mean, having been a biological weapons inspector for the United States officially in 2002, again in 2003, and then representing the United States interests at the first biological weapons and biological research program that was hosted in Tehran in 2004. A lot of people sit there and go, okay, well, hold on a minute. Biological weapons, we didn't know this was about biological weapons. Well, the problem is, ever since the 1950s, the late 1950s, even though the United States passed laws against biological weapons, we decided that it would be in our national interest to research biological weapons, allegedly so we could come up with countermeasures.
And in terms of how people have been responding to this is the last piece of my little triplicate there.
Well, according to a lot of social media statistics, that video is now the most watched video in the history of the internet with over 3 billion views. So I have been amazed at how viral, to your point, it definitely got viral. It made it around the world. This is not a pro or anti-America message. This is a very clear message that the world needs to pay attention to the fact that right now in the United States, we have active biological weapons programs on a number of pathogens. And as a society, this is a conversation we should be having. I'm not saying that we're the bad guys or the good guys. I'm simply saying that it's an important conversation. And what I'll tell you is that there is a certain degree of global embrace of an American saying America might have something it needs to look at. It is a particularly interesting location for me to be sitting today, given that over a decade ago, I sat in this very chair right here in the European Union Parliament. And at that time, I warned the world of what was coming. During that conversation that was hosted at the time by the Green and EFA and a number of the other parties of the European Union's various representations, we were having a conversation on whether Europe should adopt the United States policy of allowing for the patents on biologically derived materials. And at the time, I urged this body, and I urged people around the world, that the weaponization of nature against humanity had dire consequences. Tragically, I sit here today with that unfortunate line that I don't like to say, which I told you so. But the fact of the matter is, we're here not for a reprisal on past decisions. We're here to actually, once again, come to the face of the human condition and ask the question, who do we want to be? What do we want humanity to look like? And rather than seeing this as an exercise in futility, which is very easy from time to time when you're in the position I'm in, I actually see this not as an exercise in futility. I see this as one of the greatest opportunities that faces us, because we now have a public conversation which is now front and center in people's minds. When this was an esoteric conversation about biological patents, nobody cared. But when that conversation came home, then it became something people can care about. So I'm actually quite grateful for this opportunity. I thank the members of Parliament for hosting this. I thank all of the translators who, I apologize in advance. I will use terminology that is probably very difficult to translate, so my apologies. And I'd also like to acknowledge the fact that many of you are aware of my involvement with this, in large part due to the amazing work of my wonderful wife, Kim Martin, who encouraged me at the very early days of this pandemic to get on front of the camera and talk about all the information that I had been sharing among very small groups around the world. And it was, in fact, her encouragement that put me in a place where many of you have heard what I have to say. Ironically, the world that I came from, that used to be very popular, my CNBC and Bloomberg presentations, which were televised on mainstream media around the world, was an audience that I lost. I can confidently say COVID diminished my fame. But I can also confidently say that I'd rather stand among the people with whom I'm standing today than any of the folks that were part of that previous world. So this is a much better place to be. My role today is to set the stage for this conversation in a historical context, because this did not come in the last 3 years. This did not come in the last 5 or 6 years. This actually is an ongoing question that probably began here in Europe in the early stages of the mid-1900s, but certainly by 1913, 1914, this conversation started right here in Central Europe. The pandemic that we alleged to have happen in the last few years also did not happen overnight. In fact, the very specific pandemic using coronavirus began in a very different time. Most of you don't know that coronavirus as a model of a pathogen was isolated in 1965. Coronavirus was identified in 1965 as one of the first infectious replicatable viral models that could be used to modify a series of other experiences of the human condition. It was isolated once upon a time associated with the common cold. But what's particularly interesting about its isolation in 1965 was that it was immediately identified as a pathogen that could be used and modified for a whole host of reasons. And you heard me correctly, that was 1965. And by the way, these slides are public domain. You're welcome to look at every single reference. Every comment that I made is based on published material, so do make sure that you look at those references. But in 1966, the very first COV coronavirus model was used as a transatlantic biological experiment in human manipulation. And you heard the date, 1966. I hope you're getting the point of what I'm saying. This is not an overnight thing. This is actually something that's been long in the making. A year before I was born, we had the first transatlantic coronavirus data sharing experiment between the United States and the United Kingdom. And in 1967, the year I was born, we did the first human trials on inoculating people with modified coronavirus. Isn't that amazing? 56 years ago, the overnight success of a pathogen that's been 56 years in engineering. And I want that to chill with all of you. Where were we when we actually allowed, in violation of biological and chemical weapons treaties, where were we as a human civilization when we thought it was an acceptable thing to do to take a pathogen for the United States and infect the world with it? Where was that conversation? And what should have been that conversation in 1967? That conversation wasn't had. Ironically, the common cold was turned into a chimera in the 1970s. And in 1975, 1976, and 1977, we started figuring out how to modify coronavirus by putting it into different animals, pigs and dogs. And not surprisingly, by the time we got to 1990, we found out that coronavirus as an infectious agent was an industrial problem for two primary industries, the industries of dogs and pigs. Dog breeders and pigs found that coronavirus created gastrointestinal problems, and that became the basis for Pfizer's first spike protein vaccine patent, filed, are you ready for this, in 1990. Did you hear what I just said? 1990. Operation Warp Speed? I'm sorry. Where's the warp and the speed? Pfizer, 1990, the very first spike protein vaccine for coronavirus. Isn't that fascinating? Isn't it fascinating that we were told that, well, the spike protein is a new thing. We just found out that that's the problem. No. As a matter of fact, we didn't just find out it was not just now the problem. We found that out in 1990 and filed the first patents on vaccines in 1990 for the spike protein of coronavirus. And who would have thought? Pfizer. Clearly the innocent organization that does nothing but promote human health. Clearly Pfizer. The organization that has not bought the votes in this chamber and in every chamber of every government around the world. Not that Pfizer. Certainly they wouldn't have had anything to do with this. But oh yes, they did. And in 1990, they found out that there was a problem with vaccines. They didn't work. You know why they didn't work? It turns out that coronavirus is a very malleable model. It transforms and it changes and it mutates over time. As a matter of fact, every publication on vaccines for coronavirus from 1990 until 2018, every single publication concluded that coronavirus escapes the vaccine impulse because it modifies and mutates too quickly for vaccines to be effective. And since 1990 to 2018, that is the published science, ladies and gentlemen. That's following the science. Following the science is their own indictment of their own programs that said it doesn't work. And there are thousands of publications to that effect, not a few hundred, and not paid for by pharmaceutical companies. These are publications that are independent scientific research that shows unequivocally, including efforts of the chimera modifications made by Ralph Baric in the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. All of them show vaccines do not work on coronavirus. That's the science. And that science has never been disputed. But then we had an interesting development in 2002. And this date is most important. Because in 2002, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill patented, and I quote, an infectious replication defective clone of coronavirus. Listen to those words, infectious replication defective. What does that phrase actually mean? For those of you not familiar with language, let me unpack it for you. Infectious replication defective means a weapon. It means something meant to target an individual, but not have collateral damage to other individuals. That's what infectious replication defective means. And that patent was filed in 2002 on work funded by NIAID's Anthony Fauci from 1999 to 2002. And that work, patented at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, mysteriously preceded SARS 1.0 by a year. Dave, are you suggesting that SARS 1.0 wasn't from a wet market in Wuhan? Are you suggesting it might have come from a laboratory in the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill? No, I'm not suggesting it. I'm telling you that's the facts. We engineered SARS. SARS is not a naturally occurring phenomenon. The naturally occurring phenomenon is called the common cold. It's called influenza-like illness. It's called gastroenteritis. That's the naturally occurring coronavirus. SARS is the research developed by humans weaponizing a life system model to actually attack human beings. And they patented it in 2002. And in 2003, giant surprise, The CDC filed the patent on coronavirus isolated from humans in violation, once again, of biological and chemical weapons treaties and laws that we have in the United States. And I'm very, very precise on this. The United States likes to talk about its rights and everything else and the rule of law and all the nonsense that we like to talk about. But we don't ratify treaties about, I don't know, defending humans. We conspicuously avoid that. We actually have a great track record of advocating for human rights and then denying them when it comes to actually being part of the international community, which is a slightly problematic thing. But let's get something very clear. When the CDC in April of 2003 filed the patent on SARS coronavirus isolated from humans, what did they do? They downloaded a sequence from China and filed a patent on it in the United States. Any of you familiar with biological and chemical weapons treaties knows that's a violation. That's a crime. That's not an innocent oops. That's a crime. And the United States Patent Office went as far as to reject that patent application on 2 occasions until the CDC decided to bribe the Patent Office to override the patent examiner to ultimately issue the patent in 2007 on SARS coronavirus. But let's not let that get away from us, because it turns out that the RT-PCR, which was the test that we allegedly were going to use to identify the risks associated with coronavirus, was actually identified as a bioterrorism threat by me in the European Union-sponsored events in 2002 and 2003, 20 years ago. That happened here in Brussels and across Europe. In 2005, this particular pathogen was specifically labeled as a bioterrorism and bioweapon platform technology. Described as such. That's not my terminology that I'm applying to it. It was actually described as a bioweapons platform technology in 2005. And from 2005 onwards, it was actually a biowarfare enabling agent, its official classification from 2005 forward. I don't know if that sounds like public health to you. Does it? Biological warfare enabling technology. That feels like not public health. That feels like not medicine. That feels like a weapon designed to take out humanity. That's what it feels like. And it feels like that because that's exactly what it is. We have been lured into believing that EcoHealth Alliance and DARPA and all of these organizations are what we should be pointing to. But we've been specifically requested to ignore the facts that over $10 billion have been funneled through black operations through the check of Anthony Fauci and a side-by-side ledger where NIAID has a balance sheet and next to it is a biodefense balance sheet equivalent dollar-for-dollar matching that no one in the media talks about. And it's been going on since 2005. Our gain-of-function moratorium, the moratorium that was supposed to freeze any efforts to do gain-of-function research. Conveniently, in the fall of 2014, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill received a letter from NIAID saying that while the gain-of-function moratorium on coronavirus in vivo should be suspended, because their grants had already been funded, they received an exemption. Did you hear what I just said? A biological weapons lab facility at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, received an exemption from the gain-of-function moratorium so that by 2016, we could publish the journal article that said, SARS coronavirus is poised for human emergence in 2016. And what, you might ask, Dave, was the coronavirus poised for human emergence? It was WIV1, Wuhan Institute of Virology Virus 1. Poised for human emergence in 2016 at the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, such that by the time we get to 2017 and 2018, the following phrase entered into common parlance among the community. There is going to be an accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen. The operative word, obviously, in that phrase, the word release. Does that sound like leak?
Does that sound like a bat and a pangolin went into a bar in the Wuhan market and hung out and had sex, and lo and behold, we got SARS-CoV-2? No. Accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen was the terminology used, and 4 times in April of 2019, 7 months before the allegation of patient number 1, 4 patent applications of Moderna were modified to include the term accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen as the justification for making a vaccine for a thing that did not exist. Keep going. If you have not done so, please make sure that you make reference in every investigation to the premeditation nature of this, because it was in September of 2019 that the world was informed that we were going to have an accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen so that by September 2020, there would be a worldwide acceptance of a universal vaccine template. That's their words, right in front of you on the screen. The intent was to get the world to accept a universal vaccine template, and the intent was to use coronavirus to get there. And the last slide. This isn't advancing, so if I could have somebody do it. Let's read this, because we have to read this into the record everywhere I go. Until an infectious disease crisis is very real, present, and at the emergency threshold, it is often largely ignored. To sustain the funding base beyond the crisis, he said, we need to increase the public understanding for the need for medical countermeasures such as a pan-influenza or pan-coronavirus vaccine. A key driver is the media, and the economics will follow the hype. We need to use that hype to our advantage to get to the real issues. Investors will respond if they see profit at the end of the process. Sounds like public health? Sounds like the best of humanity? No, ladies and gentlemen, this was premeditated domestic terrorism stated at the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2015, published in front of them. This is an act of biological and chemical warfare perpetrated on the human race, and it was admitted to in writing that this was a financial heist and a financial fraud. Investors will follow if they see profit at the end of the process. Let me conclude by making 5 very brief recommendations. The last slide. Nature was hijacked. This whole story started in 1965 when we decided to hijack a natural model and decide to start manipulating it. Science was hijacked when the only questions that could be asked were questions authorized under the patent protection of the CDC, the FDA, the NIH, and their equivalent organizations around the world. We didn't have independent science. We had hijacked science. And unfortunately, there was no moral oversight in violation of all of the codes that we stand for. There was no independent, financially disinterested, independent review board ever impaneled around coronavirus, not once. Not once. Not since 1965. We do not have a single independent IRB ever impaneled around coronavirus. So morality was suspended for medical countermeasures. And ultimately, humanity was lost because we decided to allow it to happen. Our job today is to say, no more gain-of-function research, period. No more weaponization of nature, period. And most importantly, no more corporate patronage of science for their own self-interest unless they assume 100% product liability for every injury and every death that they maintain. Thank you very much.
I want to hear your history with the virus, how you were able to get to the point where you could say, I told you so. And then what is it about you and your training that, because I want to anticipate criticism here, and I'm wondering if you could also address what your training and background is such that you're in a position to have evaluated these sorts of things.
Yeah, well, there's probably 2 threads that are worth pulling, Drew. The first is that in the early 1990s, I ran the clinical trials program for the University of Virginia Medical School. where we established in the Commonwealth of Virginia the first ever medical device contract research organization for clinical trials to submit to the FDA. And so my medical school appointments, which were in orthopedic surgery and radiology at the time, were the academic reason why I was there, but the business reason I was there was to run clinical trials. So my expertise professionally was doing clinical trials for the FDA. So I kind of know what I'm doing there. And the companies that we worked with included Siemens and GE and Picker and Diagnostic Systems Labs and all kinds of companies, Boehringer Mannheim, others, where our work was to evaluate medical technologies and medical claims. So I have a background in the sciences, and in fact, my PhD was the first kinematic assessments of how to look at soft tissue and MRIs. So it's a very geeky subject, but that's what I was doing for my PhD as well. The other arm of this is that in the 1990s, I had a company called Mosaic Technologies, and we did treaty restricted technology transfer. And specifically what that means is that we went into countries around the world who were prohibited from exporting offensive military technology. And our job on behalf of the United States government was to review technologies that had military origins, but find ways for those to be used in civilian applications. And many of those, by the way, were in healthcare applications, telemedicine, various imaging technologies, et cetera. And it was in the late 1990s that I became very involved in looking at the Armed Forces Institute Pathology and Fort Detrick and other programs where we saw an enormous amount of things that appeared to blur the of biological and potentially chemical weapons treaties and laws here in the United States under 18 U.S. Code. And it was beginning in that period of time, the late 1990s, and specifically in 1999, that we encountered a very concerning piece of information. And that was the work that was done at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where in the decade preceding, from 1990 until 1999, the Pfizer patent on the coronavirus vaccine, which was established largely for veterinary applications using a spike protein vaccine platform for veterinary sciences. In 1999, a project was done at UNC Chapel Hill where trans species modifications of a chimera of coronavirus was being done, and it was specifically being done to target the heart tissue in rabbits. And it specifically created cardiomyopathy in rabbits. And it was that attracted Dr. Anthony Fauci and NIAID's research dollars, which gave rise to a very alarming patent that was filed in 2002 at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, which actually patented an infectious replication defective clone derived from the coronavirus model. And this is quite alarming because the words infectious replication defective not only suggested, but the patent went on to quite literally describe the use of coronavirus not as a descriptor of a pathogen, but a biologically derived substance that could be used both as a vaccine vector, but could also be used as a biological weapons agent. And in 2002, that patent was filed. The publications around that were back in 2001 and in 2002. And that gave rise to a series of modifications of coronavirus, which precede SARS 1.0. So, Kelly, I am a very outspoken critic of Rand Paul because I'm a kind of a prosecutor. I actually studied law at the University of Virginia, too. A lot of people don't know that, but I'm a huge fan of delivering the evidence when you have it. And in October of 2014, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill received a letter from Anthony Fauci's NIAID saying that Ralph Barrick's research, and by the way, if you want to look at it, I have it up on my Twitter feed. It says this research is gain of function, and it says gain of function. It doesn't say anything else. It says it's gain of function. And not only does it say it's gain of function, but Kelly, it gets worse. they actually modified the gain-of-function grant and authorized it to be used in vivo. Now, that's a Latin term. Not everybody's familiar with that. But a lot of gain-of-function research is done with computer simulation or in laboratory models or in petri dishes or in what have you. But this particular gain-of-function was not only not subject to the moratorium. The last sentence and the last paragraph on the first page of that letter says that since the grant is already funded, you can keep doing the moratorium research. It says it right on the page that, once again, I put up on my Twitter feed. So people who sit there going, well, are you reading into something? No, I'm not reading into something. It actually says it's a gain-of-function study. You are authorized to keep going during the moratorium because we already funded you. Now, I don't know what kind of moratorium that is, but what I also know is the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill knew that what they were doing was in violation of the moratorium because in a very interesting article, and I just had it here because I figured I might anticipate your story, right? This particular article, SARS-like WIV1 COV poised for human emergence, which was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences from research that was subjected to review in September of 2015. So for those of you paying attention, during the moratorium, at the end of this paper, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill violated its own institutional protocol by impaneling 2 institutional review boards. One that reviewed ethics of the study, and 2, which reviewed the ethics of violating the law with respect to the moratorium. And by the way, that's not me hypothecating this. The paper actually says that they reviewed the illegal presumption of doing the research that was in fact subject to the moratorium, and they published that they decided that it was okay to violate the moratorium. So this isn't a close call. This is Anthony Fauci lying, and Rand Paul has had that piece of paper every time Fauci has been opposite him in the Senate, and not once has Rand Paul held the piece of paper from NIAID and said, Anthony Fauci, you said it was gain of function on coronavirus with, are you ready for this? The WIV1 coronavirus. Kelly, by now you should be asking, well, what on earth is WIV1? Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's pull the cover back on that. That's Wuhan Institute of Virology Virus 1, which was reassembled during the gain of function moratorium at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, in violation of 18 U.S. Code on biological weapons. So I don't know how many ways. This is not a close call. This is not a debate on, well, what's the definition of a thing? This is them using their own language and saying, in October 2014, we know there's a moratorium. We know we're violating the moratorium. We know we're violating it because there's money in violating it. We know we're doing it in North Carolina, and we know we're doing it on the Wuhan Institute of Virology Virus 1. How much more do you need to prove that this was not some sort of nonsensical lab leak or accident or anything else? There is zero chance that a 2016 publication that says that the Wuhan virus is poised for human emergence leaves us with any doubt that humans built this, that humans deployed it, and that the United States and China acted in collaboration to unleash hell on earth.
I'm not sure I'm getting what the implication of that is before you go on to the next part. What is the implication of those observations?
Yeah. So in September 18th, 2019, the World Health Organization got together and published in a thing called the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, published a statement that said that we were going to actually have a respiratory pathogen release. And that respiratory pathogen release, this is their words straight out of their document, would by September 2020 lead the world to accept a universal vaccine. On the 19th of September, the White House signed what became the precursor to Operation Warp Speed, which was a day later, when Donald Trump signed the executive order that put in place a rapid response vaccine production mandate as part of an executive order that was for both pan-influenza and experimental new pathogen vaccine production. That took place on the 19th of September, 2019. We have Event 201 in October of 2019. And then in November, a month before Patient 1, allegedly in China, there is a material transfer agreement between the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill's Ralph Baric and Moderna, transferring a sequence of a spike protein associated with the Wuhan virus coronavirus for the production, in Ralph Baric's written statement to the Financial Times, where he says that the information he transferred was for the Moderna injection, predating Patient 1. And the evidence said that Anthony Fauci knew it wasn't novel. Ralph Baric knew that he had patented the methodology. And the UNC Chapel Hill labs knew that they had signed the material transfer agreement and assigned, by the way, the 2002 patent that I mentioned. They had assigned it in 2018, a year ahead of time. They had assigned it back to NIH in an unprecedented and undocumented consideration move, which has never been done before. So all of this is at least a year premeditated, all of it. But we have to add a couple other pieces which unfortunately blow up the justification side of this. Remember that side by side with NIAID's funding, side by side with that was DARPA's funding since 2005 of a biological weapons technology platform. You cannot put that genie back in the bottle. That is a statement that they made. It is a statement that they funded.
That's maybe where I agree with you. Maybe that's where the evangelical physicians are coming in. They know that, they see that, and they're thinking, oh, we have to have these countermeasures. We must come up with these gigantic universal platforms, and we've got to figure out a way to get there. And then they become Machiavellian in their way of getting there.
Go ahead, Dave.
Well, all I was going to say is I think you're right, but my issue here, and this is where I have been outspoken and singular on this particular issue. You cannot take the 2015 statement of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and you cannot spin that into anything other than a violation at the time of the Patriot Act's prohibition on coercion. The reason why the public is going to accept this is because of the media hype, not because of the facts, not because of the evidence.
Yeah,
we are going to use the media hype to accept it. And let's get clear on a second thing. The first funding for Moderna, Flagship Ventures, which is a mysterious organization, that's a whole nother show. But Flagship Ventures co-funded Moderna and CRISPR at the same time. Kelly, it's not just about mRNA. This is about ultimately editing genes in the long play.
Right.
And I've said this many times. This is not about mRNA. This is about ultimately getting the public to accept CRISPR and shutting up the Catholic Church, which was the largest opposition to gene editing up until COVID. And the only way you get the camel's nose under the tent is get mRNA, create the problem, get CRISPR to be a solution, and the Catholic Church has painted themselves into a corner saying that this was God's will.
COVID-19, the whole thing was premeditated. It was murder. It was active terrorism. And let's not pretend like maybe there's a more complex explanation for, the facts. And the facts are, for 58 years, the United States, the UK, in collaboration with researchers around the world, planned to use coronavirus to instill the most tyrannical reform of society that this generation has ever seen.
It's just incredible when you start going through the dates.
Throughout the 70s, going into the early 80s, what they found was that this crazy thing that they had labeled coronavirus was engineerable to all sorts of specification. And what's important about the vaccine that Pfizer patented in 1990, so when I hear somebody come along and tell me that they had Operation Warp Speed, that only took 30 years of failed trial after failed trial, which included as recently a series of publications that said coronavirus and the vaccine concept cannot coexist.
It's so hard to believe that they left such a blatant paper trail.
You know, we've spent the last 3 years going, no, they couldn't have really planned this, right? We wouldn't have governments in collusion with this. We wouldn't have like China in on it too, would we? Well, the answer is yeah, all of them were in on it.
You finished that speech in the EU with some strong statements that nature was hijacked,
Science was hijacked.
morality was suspended,
No more gain-of-function research.
no more weaponization of nature
No more corporate patronage of science.
unless they assume 100% product liability.
For every injury and every death that they maintain. Thank you very much.
The audacity of the crime paralyzes us to go, holy shit, we are actually now living in a world where we know that 8 to 9 million people were murdered by the Allied governments. Murdered. And we're fine with that.
We can't take it on if we don't have the right conversation. And the reason I'm so grateful to both of you for this conversation is the public conversation is not about who done it. The public conversation needs to be about what is the criminal conspiratorial structure of how the public sector and the private sector have hoodwinked the public to harm it while enriching themselves. This is no different from the conversations that took place at the turn of the last century in 1904 to the period in 1911, when we had the Anderson Commission and the Peugeot Commission who investigated J.P. Morgan and said, hey, it's not right that one guy controls 86% of the GDP of a country. That's not right. That's not American. And what we need to be doing is having the right conversation. If we did not understand what went wrong with opioids in that, did not understand what went wrong with COVID in that EUA, if we keep thinking this is symptom level control, then we lose. But if we understand that this is a fundamental structure that the public can do something about, and if we have a thoughtful conversation about what that problem is, we, the people, can take our nation and the world's ethical lead back. But we have to have the right conversation to get there.